today, I mean, you can almost say that Canada has become a fake nice country. It's a country that desperately wants to think of itself as nice. But you know when nice is being enforced in your speech laws, you know it's not a nice country. And it's certainly not a free country.
I'm Tamara Ugolini with Rebel News here at the Revival Theatre on College Street in Toronto for an event called Canada's Free Speech Crisis. It's been sponsored by the Lighthouse Community Foundation and will feature free speech loving speakers such as constitutional lawyer Bruce Pardy, journalist Meghan Murphy, who is one of Canada's first voices in the gender identity and gender ideology sphere, discussing the harms imposed on women and their intimate spaces, and former CBC journalist Trish Woods. The event tonight will be moderated by journalist Jonathan Kay, and there will be about 130 people in attendance. So we're going to touch base with some of the speakers, find out what they're going to talk about, why it's important, and of course, what brought people out to this important event tonight. Stay tuned. Bruce, I suppose right off the hop, when and where did Canada come into a free speech crisis?
I don't think there's any one moment. This has been a gradual thing. But if you compare where we are today with where we might have been, say, in the 1970s, things have gotten appreciably worse. There are all kinds of formal laws, but also policies and behaviors of institutions and so on that severely limit the speech that you are expected to adhere to. For example, the Trudeau government, just to take the latest news, the Trudeau government is apparently considering criminalizing residential school denialism in the same way that Holocaust denialism is prohibited in some places. And that means that you're not allowed to say what you think about the history of residential schools. That's not the speech of a free country. When your government is supervising the truth, then you know you don't have free speech. This may be a surprise to some people, but the criteria for free speech is not truth. Fake news is free speech. You have no obligation, or you shouldn't have anyway, you should have no obligation to tell the truth as defined by the government, because as soon as you're into that territory, the government is controlling everything. So because there's no way to hand off the authority over truth to anybody, that means that truth can't be the criteria for whether or not you're allowed to say something. In a country with free speech, you are allowed to express your thoughts for the sole reason that they are yours and for no other reason.
One of Canada's first journalists to speak out against gender theory and the ideology behind gender. How has that changed over the course of, 12-ish years since you first became kind of ingrained in this topic?
Well, Canada is finally talking about it, so that's great. When I spoke out, no one was talking about it, and nobody wanted me to talk about it either. I testified at the Senate against Bill C-16, which is Canada's gender identity legislation, in 2017.
The rights of women and girls are being pushed aside to accommodate a trend. Bill C-16 may sound persuasive in its efforts to be open-minded and inclusive, but it rests on very shaky ground. I implore you to further consider the consequences and implications of these ideas, this language, and this legislation before jumping on this bandwagon.
And I had been trying to get the word out and get people to understand the dangers of gender identity ideology, the impact on women and women's rights in particular, for several years at that point. And, even when it came to legislation, even when we got to the point where Bill C-16 was on the table and I was like, you guys, this is dangerous, please listen up, we're going to essentially nullify women's rights, which is what happened. No one listened, no one wanted to talk about it, the media refused to cover it. It was just a fight all the way through. Every time I would try to speak about it, we would try to do events, so on and so forth. We would be protested. We lost our venues over and over and over again. It was terrifying, threats, actual violence, so on and so forth. And now I'm seeing Canadians organize and speak out. The 1 million March for Children was amazing, and I'm so happy that people are realizing what's going on, even though it took a lot longer than I would have liked, because we're at a point where we're very much in it.
Right.
It's hard to back out now, but people are fighting, and I think that's great.
I'm here with journalist Trish Wood from Trish Wood is Critical podcast. When did Canada's free speech in crisis issue really come to a head for you and become apparent?
I think it was during COVID-19 because I was a science journalist at CBC, and for some reason during COVID, all the rules changed about what people could and couldn't say, what journalists were prepared to say and wouldn't say, and it felt to me like all of the institutions, the whole of our institutions were lining up to support what we were led to believe was a consensus and what actually was not a consensus. I realized that the people who were pushing the edicts onto us also were not doing basic science, which is a risk-benefit ratio for everything you ask people to do in public health. You have to weigh the risks and the benefits. They weren't doing that. And I thought, how are they getting away with this? And the bottom line was, we were not allowed to talk about it. So what I realized, and it was a real shocker for me, was that this country cannot survive in an environment where people cannot say what they believe to be true.
What do you think was the point where that became evident in this country? Was there a certain movement or a point in history where this became more tolerated than prior?
Well, there have been moments of censorship for a long time. I mean, if you go back decades into the previous century, there was censorship of obscenity. There were people who wanted to limit heresy, all kinds of things. And so it's not a singular moment. We now have professional regulatory bodies that think of it as their role to tell their members, whether or not they're doctors or lawyers or nurses or what the case may be, what the proper thinking is on a subject, whether it's gender and sex categories, whether or not it's COVID, whether or not it's equity, diversity, and inclusion. They are bringing in rules and expectations that their members will comply with the guidance that either the regulatory body or the government is providing. No? Or else. And so, if I can put it this way, Canada today, I mean, you can almost say that Canada has become a fake nice country. It's a country that desperately wants to think of itself as nice. But when nice is being enforced in your speech laws, it's not a nice country. And it's certainly not a free country.
I'm very relieved that there are no protests here because I don't know. I mean, I don't know how seriously people take it, but for me, it's very scary. I've gotten endless threats of violence and death and worse, and I know women who've been physically assaulted. And every event I've ever done, as a result, I have bodyguards and a security detail, and we didn't hear because it seemed that there was no threat. So I think the fact that we're hosting a free speech event, it's not specifically focused on the gender identity issue, though I do plan to talk about the gender identity issue, helped us out. I do think the conversation is for sure opening up, and it's becoming more acceptable to talk about things that it was completely unacceptable to talk about just 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that's great.
What role did feminism and the feminist movement play in ideologies like EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and this gender identity, gender theory proliferation?
Well, that's a very interesting and complicated question, but let me just try and give you a simple answer, or one aspect of it. So for my money, you can trace a lot of the trouble that we have now, not exclusively, but in part, to an argument that the feminists made. And I can't tell you exactly when, and I can't tell you exactly what wave it was part of, but the argument went like this. We are equal, and we are special. We are entitled to all the rights and privileges of men, But we are also entitled to our own special privileges and rights because we are women. So what result does this have? It means, on the one hand, that there can be no exclusively men's spaces. I mean, you can't have an all-men's club. You can't have an all-men's professional association. You can't have an all-men's firm. Okay. But it's necessary and important that we have health clubs only for women and professional associations only for women, and then we should be allowed to have women-only firms. So in other words, it's a double standard. And that double standard has become embedded in many of our laws, including about speech, wherein the rights and privileges that you have depend upon what group you belong to. That was a feminist idea. The group for them was women. But now it's not limited to women. Now it depends upon your gender and your race and your inclinations in various ways. But in some ways, the women are now suffering from that idea because part of the gender activism is based upon this idea, and the women now are under the thumb of the idea that men who say they're women are able to swim in the pool with the women. But this is the kind of thing that the women themselves introduced, the feminists did, way back when. So in this sense, I would say, in part, they're the author of their own misfortune.
Women that I know, and myself, of course, we tried to organize events for many, many years. In Vancouver, women were trying to organize in various places in the U.S., and it was next to impossible. And these are just regular women, and like you say, they don't have money to hire these huge security details, to, rent out a hotel or somewhere that would be safe to host an event. And the kinds of places that they could afford to do events would always get so much harassment and so many threats that they would most often cave. So it did inhibit the conversation from happening at all. And, the women who were trying to speak about this for many years prior, we don't have real power in the world, which makes it sort of all the more amusing in a way that we're protested by so many people. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not an oligarch. I'm not part of an institution. I don't have political power. I'm just a writer, and I'm just trying to speak about things that concern me. And I mean, the extent and the measures that these people will take to stop just me from speaking. I mean, last time I was in Toronto in 2019 to speak, I was protested by 700 people. And it was just me giving a talk and trying to do a Q&A at the library.
Everybody believes in free speech. If you ask anybody, if you ask Justin Trudeau about free speech, he says much. He believes in free speech. And if you check the Constitution of China, it has a guarantee of free speech in it. So everybody believes in free speech, but if you press people on the street when you ask them, they'll often say, yes, I believe in free speech, but, as you were saying. So the extent to which they actually believe in free speech is contained within that exception. So what is the principled exception to free speech? When should you not be allowed to say what you want? Mm-hmm. And for my money, one of the main exceptions is violence. You're not allowed to use words to threaten imminent violence. That's an assault. It's a crime. That makes sense, because we all have a right to be free from violence. So if someone comes up to you in the street and says, I'm going to bash you in the head if you don't give me your purse, well, that's an assault. And so, I'm sorry, yes, free speech, but my but is no violence. But for a lot of other people, the but is much more expansive and not based upon this violence idea. It's simply speech that they don't like, the content of which they don't like. And this is really the test about whether you believe in free speech or not as a concept. If you believe in free speech, except for speech whose content you object to, then you don't really believe in free speech.
Where do we go from here? How do we get out of this free speech crisis in Canada?
Well, we talk about it, and we never stop talking, and we don't back down, and we pressure our political representatives, and we go to the school board, and we talk to our neighbors, and we put up signs. I think that I'm a big supporter of a diversity of tactics. I think you can set up meetings with your school, with the administrators, to talk about your concerns. I think you can have a meeting with your MP. I think having these events is really, really important and really empowering. I've done a lot of these events over the years, and I love doing them because the feedback that I usually get from people is that they felt so alone and they were afraid to talk about it, and they come to these events and they see familiar faces sometimes, or they can connect with people and start organizing with other people. They don't feel alone. They know that they're not the only one who wants to talk about this, who has concerns. And I think it really galvanizes people to get together and to realize that there are so many of us. Just because the media, some media, but most media won't cover our points of view at all, or they outright vilify us. Yeah, I think that people don't realize how many people there actually are in Canada who share their concerns and do want to do something, and that's why I think these events are so important.
If you want to find out how you can uphold free speech in wake of government-sanctioned censorship, please head over to our special website at stopthecensorship.ca. There you can find out what actions Rebel News is taking to make sure that a free, independent press and our free speech across the board is upheld. All of that and more at stopthecensorship.ca.